socialists are protesting cuts to the CBC.
Decapitated heads on fence posts.
When did you first realize that you were a communist? Shouts of death to Harper. Death to Harper can be heard. If you like your news sensationalized, then you are probably looking forward to these cuts. Sadly, not everyone sees it that way. You don't think then that the budget deficit is an adequate reason for cutting funding to the CBC?
Although the CBC had become more self-sufficient, when we set up the CBC, there was never an expectation that they should be self-sufficient. There is a budget shortfall with the CBC. That's really a result of the glut of advertising dollars. The fact that those dollars have gone away doesn't mean that we should cut the valuable role that the CBC plays.
I think it's important that in Canada we support our culture. There's no other venue in our country that supports arts in this fashion.
I want to see a stronger CBC, not a weaker one.
CBC's become very important to me. Other networks have their sponsors that they have to answer to.
The CBC is an important part of Canadian culture. It's a voice that we wouldn't hear on other radio stations or TV broadcasts.
It allows you to understand what the other side of the country is doing. It's a crucial thing to Canadian unity.
It's important to fund the CBC as well as it's important to have as many media sources as possible in Canada.
There's all sorts of different solutions that we could bring to the table, be it some sort of short-term or temporary loan, potentially come to a better solution than eliminating 800 jobs.
So you don't think that the private broadcasters then are meeting those needs?
It's really not in their interest to tell some of those stories. They depend on advertising revenue in order to fund their operations. They're not necessarily going to tell that story, whereas the CBC isn't limited by that because they have a budget that is coming directly to taxpayer dollars. In particular, I love CBC podcasts, and that's some of the content that I think that we need to continue to fund.
It's the only kind of in-depth analysis we get in this country. I live in Medicine Hat. CBC Radio is our lifeline. It's part of what defines us as Canadians.
Far more in depth than mainstream media.
I'm very concerned about the cuts that are being made to the CBC, the federal government's failure to provide adequate support.
800 job cuts is going to have a huge impact.
At the same time that they're bailing out private industry, they're failing to adequately support this key public institution. Calgarians and Canadians want CBC to continue to thrive.
It's our alarm clock in the morning, and often we go to sleep listening to CBC radio podcasts. To have a week in CBC will have a big impact on our lives. Support CBC and give it proper funding.
It doesn't make sense to lay people off and then they're going to end up on EI. If we have to pay for them anyway, they might as well be producing something people care about and obviously love.
The sounds of the CBC are in my mind from when I was a kid. It gives every community a chance to define its own culture as opposed to letting somebody else hand it down to us.
When did you first realize that you were a communist?
There's always going to be a role for government within the economy. If I suggested that I support a public health care system, I don't think that makes me a communist in any way, shape, or form. I support some role of the government in providing Canadians with a voice in the media.
By cutting funding, they're essentially dismantling our public broadcaster piece by piece. They are dismantling our public wealth.
Well, this is really a hard time for all news media. How about instead of the government funding the CBC, they could take those funds and they could direct it to readingfornewtimes.com.
Do you guys do any investigative journalism at all? Do you guys have the resources to really get the boots on the ground to make sure that the reporting gets done?
We do movie reviews.
I'll never forget listening to a link-up of whales in the north, on the east coast and the west coast. It really kind of brings Canada together. There's no other institution that does it as well as CBC.
Newspapers are shutting down all over. Maybe people just don't want news.
There needs to be different ways of people getting their news. The news media plays a really fundamental role within our democracy of making sure that we hold people that are powerful to account. One of the big problems with the private broadcasters is that it's becoming far too expensive for them to fund the sort of investigative journalism that we need to really get to the bottom of some of the bigger problems that our society is facing. Regardless of the funding mechanism, we as a society have made it clear that these things are important to us and they're important to our democracy in Canada.
Economics 101 says the last time you want to cut spending is when the economy is contracting. But at readingfornewtimes.com, we don't see it that way. With the CBC out of the way, we'll finally be Canada's predominant news source. And now, a story about a cat stuck in a tree.